objections.
Okay. Okay, so let's jump in. So I guess first things first, and that is, what is an electric vehicle? I know it's a very elementary question, but it's important to know that there are several types of electric vehicles. And what I'll do here is just briefly cover the types of vehicles in general. I think we're all very familiar with number one, which is our typical gas or diesel vehicle. You have a fossil fuel input, an engine, and that's what propels the car. We have number two is the hybrid electric vehicle. And that a good example is the Prius. The energy input is still fossil fuel. However, there is a battery and a small motor that is used to optimize the efficiency of the vehicle. Number 3, 4, and 5, these are all considered electric vehicles. The number 3 is the plug-in electric vehicle, or PHEV. The Chevy Volt and also the BMW i3 are good examples. You have a fossil fuel input, so you have an internal combustion engine, but you also have that engine actually is used as a generator to charge the battery of the electric car. So primary propulsion is still the electric motor, and you also have the ability to charge the car with, by plugging it in. But in the event that you run out of, you're low on battery energy, a motor can actually kick in, burn fossil fuel to essentially charge the battery. The number 4 is the fuel cell electric vehicle. The input is hydrogen, compressed hydrogen. That is used in a fuel cell to charge a battery, and the battery is used to run the electric motor. And then lastly, you have the simplest of them, and you can see here, essentially you have the battery, you have the electric motor, and the input is purely electricity. So a good example of number 5 is the Nissan Leaf, the Teslas that you see out there. A good example of number 4 is the Mirai, the Toyota Mirai. Just quickly, why EVs and why do we advocate for this? For me, a primary motivator is the fact that it's a mechanism by which we can dramatically reduce emissions, carbon emissions into the atmosphere, which contribute to climate change. So we see that as a primary benefit, but there are others as well. So EVs are very efficient, and there was an EPA chart that I saw where they can be as much as 100% efficient when you take into account the fact that when these cars slow down, they're actually regenerating electricity. They're actually charging the battery. So if you're going downhill, or you're pressing on the brake, or you're letting off the accelerator, it's actually slowing down, charging the vehicle, and you can get up to 100% efficiency with the battery electric car. And because there are no tailpipe emissions, at least for the pure battery electric vehicle, you don't have the contribution to local air pollution, which is also a very significant thing. Because they are very efficient, they save consumers money, right? It's good for the pocketbook. They're also cheaper to fuel, and I have a quick slide to show you that later. As well as they're cheaper to maintain. You don't have a lot of moving parts. It's technology is very simple compared to a gas vehicle, and there's less to maintain. And then lastly, for those of you who have driven one, you know that it's a very different experience from a gas car. You've got instant torque, it's smooth, it's quiet, it's clean. So a lot of benefits associated with that, which is why we advocate for it. So where are we here in Hawaii? What's the state of EV adoption here in the state? This is now dated, but I looked at the figures for February, and it's like 18,136 or something like that now, as of February. But the main thing to demonstrate here is the fact that adoption has started to accelerate over time. And we're now at, I think it's 30% year over year, growth as far as the adoption of EVs go. You have the breakdown here by island, of course. Honolulu or Oahu has the lion's share, given the population. But the important thing to note is that there are over 1 million passenger vehicles in the state, and what we are looking at here is less than 2% of the passenger vehicles in the state. And importantly, most of those are gasoline vehicles, which burn 30 million gallons of gasoline each month. So it's accelerating, but we can do more. Now we have a long way to go to enhance this, but the conditions are improving. I call these things the enablers. They used to be the barriers. So affordability, driving range, choice, these are things that are, and public charging, these are things that are heavily influential in the adoption of electric vehicles. This one I like to share with the public, the audience, is that the cars are becoming more affordable. As time with economies of scale, competition, et cetera, you're now seeing long-range EVs that are, this is the list of EVs available here under $40,000 and $40,000, and you can see that there are quite a few choices to be had. The other thing that's really important is that pre-owned EVs are becoming more and more available. I took a screenshot here from Craigslist, and you can see across the state affordable EVs. Some are the long-range ones, and many are the shorter range ones. But there's almost one EV out there that will meet almost any need. I mentioned earlier the cost to fuel these cars. This is a good calculator. If you're in the market for one, this is a good calculator. ChooseEVs.com. You get the opportunity to input the local fuel price and also electricity price, and do a comparison between a gas car and an electric car. Obviously, this is dated, right? Fossil fuel, the gas prices are up. Utility prices will eventually go up. When I did this comparison, which was a high-end Camry with a Model 3 long range, we were able to see 20 miles more for the price of a gallon of gas with the electric car. And during the course of a year, assuming 10,000 miles driven, that could add up, right? So there are these financial benefits for ownership. They cost less to maintain. This is from Consumer Reports. Through the lifetime of the vehicle, it's less than about $5,000. And I can personally attest to the even just the brake, the amount of brake usage. My original Leaf, which is with my in-laws now, it now has over 80,000 miles on the car, and it's still on the original brake pads. The other thing that is it's less of it's now not a barrier. It used to be a barrier. My first EV was the Nissan Leaf, 80 miles for a full charge. And that one we used just in East Hawaii, never took it to the west side because, we didn't want to get stuck on the side of the road. But today you see a number of long range EVs, and I consider anything above 200 miles, 150 to 200 miles will suffice for many people here on the islands. And you can see that the driving ranges are going up. You have 400, 500 miles to a charge. The form factors are changing, so you have more and more manufacturers stepping up with their Tesla killers. You've got small cars to large cars, SUVs. You name it, the form factors are just expanding in terms of the number of cars that are types of cars that are available. So there's almost one for any individual's choice for vehicle, and the trucks are coming, right? I think we've all heard about the F-150, the electric F-150, the Rivians. Tesla's coming up with their Cybertruck. So the trucks are coming out as well. And clearly here in the islands with contractors and people just favoring trucks, this is going to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. A few more slides here. So public charging, this is I consider this still a key barrier to adoption here. And I'm explicitly referring to public charging. And the reason for that is while many EV owners today have the opportunity, the privilege of charging at home, and that's very convenient. Most of my charging is done here at like 95%, maybe 99%, right? And the only time we charge it is when we go to Kona. And that's just to top it off for just a little bit. So most of the charging can happen at home. And for those of us who own EVs, it's a pattern of, you park, you plug it in, and you unplug when you're ready to go. Very similar to topping off your mobile phone. The challenge is, of course, that this is not feasible for everybody, right? We have many people that live in apartments, in condos, or they're renting and they're not able to manipulate their parking situation, so they have to rely on public charging. And without that, people hesitate. They hesitate. They're concerned that they will not be able to utilize the car effectively. And we're seeing evidence of that in Oahu. We have there's stories of EV owners that have given up on the EVs because they just couldn't maintain the car with the inadequate public charging. So we've been emphasizing this is a really important thing with the legislature, because we want to ensure that that the transition to electric vehicles, to clean transportation, is an equitable one. We have a lot of low, moderate income households here, and we want to be able to ensure that they can adopt and make the transition just like people that are well off. This is I did a screenshot here of the charging situation across the state, the major islands. And I just wanted to call attention to the fact that, the green dots are the level 2 chargers. So these are not as fast. You'll have to linger there for several hours to get to fully charge. And then the orange ones are fast chargers. These can, top off your battery in 30 minutes or so. And the main thing I want to call attention to here, and we've been emphasizing this as well with our leaders, is that there are these areas on islands where there's just not enough charging stations. And it allows us to highlight the inequities that are inherent in the system and help us with policy changes that we're endorsing. So let me pause and ask if anyone has any questions before I move on to the strategies that we, yes, Joseph.
I know, you can call me Joho. So you've told us a lot of the pros, but can we talk about the cons, such as EVs are traditionally more expensive to repair, and they take 1.5 times more man hours to do maintenance. Although they require less maintenance, when you do have to bring them into the shop, you have to typically take them to the dealer, which typically charges way more. And you talk about right to repair. A lot of your contractors know how to fix a combustion engine. They do not know how to fix a software issue. Even if they had the programming to do it and the tools, Tesla wouldn't give them the permission. It would void the warranty. You have to bring it to the Tesla dealership. So aren't these some cons and some considerations that potential purchasers should consider? Is this one of the reasons why so many people still don't buy EVs? Because if there was a problem under the hood, they wouldn't know how to fix it, and they wouldn't even have the right to do so.
So let's talk about cons. So as far as maintenance goes, right, and I can share my experience with both Nissan and Tesla. So with the Nissan, the only time that we had a repair was when the air conditioning was out. And in a situation like that, we didn't have to take it to Nissan. We actually took it to a local AC repair shop. They were able to do it. Tesla, and this is for a car that we've had since 2011. It's now with my in-laws, and they live just a quarter mile from us. So we're very close. We're able to understand what's happening with the car. They rely on us for the maintenance. With the Tesla, the service situation is different, right? So here on Hawaii Island, we don't have a service station. However, we have Ranger service. We have a technician that actually comes to the house to do the service. And I've had my Tesla since 2014, and I have to admit I had to ship the car once to Oahu because there was a motor issue, and in a situation like that, again, granted this is a car under warranty, they paid for the shipping, and they gave me a rental car for the duration of the repair and until the car was returned. All the other repairs that were done in my garage. So the technician actually came with the parts and the tools, and they were able to do repairs, including a steering rack repair, which you typically would think would have to be done in a shop. So my experience has been more that, and again, this is for cars that are under warranty, right? At least the Tesla, it hasn't been an issue. The thing about frequency of repair, I think, is an important thing, right? It's there again. There's less to break, right? Because you don't have the heat associated with all the mechanicals with a internal combustion engine vehicle. So there is the motor, there is the battery. There are maintenance items like the 12-volt battery and the wiper blades and the tires and alignment and all that. But those things can be done in, many of those things can be done in, like, normal tire shops, for example, alignment and, tire repairs and things along those lines. That said, there's a perception, right? What you described is also one of the things that we need to, one of the reasons why we do all the education and advocacy is we want to ensure that people understand the actual situation with the vehicles, because there are these notions. I mentioned all these things about range and cost and price, et cetera, et cetera. The perception out there still is that, with an electric car, you might get stranded by the side of the road. There's not enough range, or they're too expensive. They're just out of range and price range. So there are these notions out there that we actively work to address. If there's anything that I would say is a con is the main battery pack. If the car is out of warranty and you need a replacement battery pack, that is a costly repair, right? A Nissan Leaf battery pack is like $6,000, or something along those lines. So that is a consideration. It's almost akin to an engine blowing out and needing to be repaired when you're dealing with a battery that has gone bad. The other thing that is a consideration is the perception that the net emissions associated with an electric car, when you consider the what's required to manufacture, to transport, et cetera, that this is higher. And I don't have a slide tonight. I took it out for some reason, but there are studies that demonstrate when you take a look at the life cycle, total life cycle, you compare gas and an electric vehicle, the life cycle emissions for a gasoline car is higher, and it's for the operation of the vehicle. So that is another consideration. And lastly, and I didn't cover this here, concerns about what to do after, how do you deal with circularity with electric cars? What do you do with the batteries when they're bad and they need to be swapped out? What happens to the swapped out battery? And also, what happens when, what happens to those batteries that need to be recycled? That whole question around what happens to the product after it's outlived its usefulness. And that is an issue, but it's also a nascent one, and it's also something that is thankfully being addressed with companies like Redwood Materials and all these companies that are coming up with strategies to upcycle and recycle the batteries. Tam, I'm sorry, go ahead, Joho.
I just wanted to say thank you,
Okay.
because I didn't know if you're going to get into the bad side, or at least the perceptions that are out there. When I think about the right to repair, I listen to, it's usually attached to John Deere, but I've also heard complaints of Tesla owners because they void the warranty if they attempt to, repair the major ticket items like the battery or the software, right? And you talk about contractors who are very handy with tools. It's great that there are new trucks coming online, but a lot of those contractors may be reluctant to go to an electric vehicle because they don't have the know-how to repair, or the manufacturer may penalize them if they attempt to repair, even if they had the background to repair an electric vehicle. And that's something that I haven't read about except anecdotally. But I do know that that's a concern of my friends who are contractors who are quite handy with a wrench. They don't want a new Tesla because they wouldn't know how to fix it. And if they did, Tesla would void their warranty.
Cam, did you have anything to add on the cons piece? I want to make sure that this is balanced, that I'm not missing anything glaring.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big conversation in terms of really assessing the pros and cons fully. I think Joho's question is a good one, because certainly there are some downsides. And, I'll give an example. I took my Chevy Bolt. I have a Bolt and a Tesla, and I took my Bolt into the dealership recently. Not a dealership, sorry, a local repair company who I called, said, hey, can I bring my Bolt in to check out the brakes? They're like, sure, bring it in. I bring it in and drop it off. They called me 2 hours later, said, hey, this electric car, I can't work on this. I was like, well, you could have told me that before I dropped off 2 hours. But they're a small local shop. They didn't know. And I don't even know exactly why they couldn't work on it. They're, I guess, a bit different because of the regen braking. So yeah, there are some growing pains. But overall, my experience with driving electric cars versus gas cars has been a dream. And so overall, I think the pros and cons clearly, particularly if you are concerned, of course, about the environment and want to, be on the forefront, then it's a pretty easy choice if you can afford a new electric vehicle. That's a different ball of wax in terms of the cost. But of course, costs are coming down quite a bit, as I'm sure Noel will talk about here in a second.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to cover costs. Okay. I did already.
You only have half an hour.
So let me get into what we do to influence behavior, right? So what do we do to get the word out? And I think this is important because this is a space where there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of people that are on the fence because they don't have all the information they need to be able to make the right decisions. So I have a long list here of the tactics. So I just kind of thought about the things that we do as an organization to engage with our various audiences. And so the number one is public education. We do this with our one-on-ones with the public. We have in-person events and we do the webinars. The in-person events are especially important because when people get behind the wheel of an electric car, or they sit in an electric car and they experience it, they start to understand exactly all these different things we talk about, right? Including regenerative braking and all these things that make an electric car very efficient. Collaboration with government and business leaders. So just as the general public, there are these notions or constructs or concepts that are incorrect, or that they don't fully understand. That translates to everybody, including business leaders and government leaders. And we see that as we start to talk about, or as we start to encourage them to do things like support bills that are related to charging infrastructure or rebates, or any of the things that we are encouraging. It almost demands that we ensure that the leader that we're conversing with is aware of the rationale for this, right? And that they're supportive of it. Same with business leaders. We are heavily engaged in media. So we have a web page, we have a website, we're on social media, newsletters. Tam and I, we've done op-eds, we've written to the local papers. It allows us to get to a much broader audience, including individuals and entities that may not necessarily be interested at this very moment in electric cars. So it allows us to broaden our reach. We partner with local and national organizations. So Blue Planet Foundation, Ulupono Initiative, the American Lung Association are examples of groups that we partner with locally. And then at the national level, there are these organizations like Plug in America, the Sierra Club, organizations that are actually focused on sustainable transportation. We also partner with them. We engage a number of volunteers here on the Big Island. For example, we have experts across the island, and when we get an inquiry from somebody who's interested in a certain type of electric car, we connect them with somebody that's in their area. There's an opportunity for them, for example, to connect with somebody who's driving a car that they're interested in. That allows us to expand our reach and also allow us to provide that one-on-one interaction with individuals who who have questions or need help. Local and state engagement. So we have clubs across the state, so Big Island, Maui, Kauai, and Oahu. And each of these clubs are engaged locally with their communities, with local government, with local businesses, but we're also engaged at the state level, and that's where Hawaii EV comes in. So we, as far as policy is concerned, for example, at the state level, we're the organization that is in charge of that. But engagement with local communities, we have the local clubs. And then lastly, a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we are, especially these days, focused on social equity. And this is the driver for our strategy with pushing for more public charging stations. It's the individuals that live in poor areas, in rural areas, in they may not have the means, for example, to buy their own home. We emphasize that for them to be able to transition, and if our goal is to transition away from fossil fuels 100%, we're going to need to have solutions that everybody can adopt, and that's why we also focus on this social equity piece. Policy. So this is another enabler, right? A really important enabler. And we're in the midst of the legislative session, and there's been a lot of heavy lifting that's transpired. But even broader than that, and I have a slide here that talks about what's happening globally. We have phaseouts that have been announced by governments across the globe, and this essentially just says by a certain date in the future, they're going to not allow for new gas cars to be sold. And we have governments, well, there's even California, right? So we have, state as well as national. And then for the US, I'm not sure how long ago now, maybe a couple of months, there was Biden's executive order that 50% of new cars be zero emission by 2030. The impact of this is it's creating this tension for change, right? You have manufacturers, you have even local governments understanding that they need to make the shift, because at some point these gas cars are not going to be sustained. And we're seeing manufacturer response, right? This is a list of the various manufacturers who have announced plans to transition to essentially electrified drivetrains in the future. And you can see, even Toyota recently had announced, and I mentioned Toyota because they've been very sticky with the gas and also the hydrogen drivetrains. But they've indicated that they've committed to electrifying, spending billions to electrify over the next decade. Locally, this is a summary of what transpired in the last session. There were a number of measures that were introduced that all had some impact on EV adoption, from funding of the public EV charging station rebates to enforcement of the Law Act 75. Essentially, it says that there's a requirement for large parking lots to have dedicated EV parking and charging. And this law is also allowing for the enforcement of that law, or that measure. The transition of the state fleet, there's a lot of pressure right now. There is a contract that we have with Sustainability Partners. So they're providing transportation as a service for the next 10 years for the state. And in the last session, there was a law that essentially specified that starting this year, January, all small gas vehicles acquired by the state need to be electrified. So Sustainability Partners is really busy now working with state agencies to provide them with electric vehicles as part of their fleet replacement strategy. Yeah. So anyway, what I wanted to highlight was that in the last session was very successful. There were a number of these bills that passed that served to encourage adoption, that served at, just in general, that enforced or created a mandate for the state to do the transition, which is a good example for the rest. And for this session, we started with about 40 bills. And as of today, there are only 6 that remain. That are moving forward. There's one for a rebate for the electric bikes and mopeds. There's one that funds a decarbonization pathway study. There's one that allows for the creation of a new rebate for hydrogen fueling stations. The creation of a transportation working group. And Tam, by the way, Hawaii EV was added to the list of groups that will be part of this working group. There's the EV charger guidelines for condos and multi-unit dwellings, and then also a rebate program for the single port EV chargers. So there were a number of bills that didn't pass that were, very disappointing. For example, a rebate for low to moderate income households for the purchase of an electric car that didn't go through. But the point is that we started off with quite a few bills. And we're now with just a handful here, and the session is not yet over. So there's still a few steps along the way that we need to take. So hopefully many of these will continue on. How do we do this? How does this organization, Hawaii EV, influence policy? And I'll just briefly take you through what we put in place to guide how we do things and what we do. So the first thing is we establish principles. Jake, you have a question?
Thanks. Yeah, just before you moved off to the next, the related topic, but thanks for all the, I found the discussion of all the different policies that are in the mix and planned over the next 28 years or so to be pretty interesting. My question is, while we're on that subject, to what degree do you expect that the hammer will have to come down, so to speak? Do you think it'll be, the announcement of policy goals plus incentives, like the types you mentioned, funding type incentives will be enough? Or do you think at a certain point, as we get closer to the days where we actually want, to get gas vehicles off the road, governments are going to have to start kind of using a little bit heavier tactics, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer for that, other than my hope is that we don't have to rely on mandates, that the market will respond. Right, we're seeing that these manufacturers are starting to invest more. Battery technology continues to evolve. We're seeing we're seeing consumer demand dictate what the manufacturers are doing, and we're seeing the demand for electric cars with certain, like Tesla, for example, triggering other manufacturers to hop on, right? And so what's happening is you have all of this interest in clean transportation, and it's resulting in costs coming down. You see that with technology in general, and then you have the big focus on charging infrastructure, right? Which is, again, like I said earlier, is going to be necessary. You can have all these cars, but if you don't have the public charging that's needed, it's not going to get anywhere. So there's a lot of that's going on. But in general, I think that with lower prices, the technology improving, the range, getting to where it's no longer an issue, and then public charging, I think that I hope that we're not going to have to rely on mandates. I mean, clearly there are goals that have been set, that we want to be able to ensure that we're able to manage emissions and ensure that we don't further accelerate global warming. And maybe if it gets to the point where we're not doing enough, that some of these things may happen, but hopefully, we don't have to get to that point. The other thing I want to highlight too is that Electric cars are not the only solution. They're one part of the solution. In fact, for Hawaii, I don't think it makes sense for us to hope that, or to strive for the conversion or transition of 1 million plus cars to electric in a relative short period of time. It's not going to happen. So what we're going to need to do is ensure that we also focus on other strategies like reduction of the need for a car, right? We call it VMT reduction. So mass transit, multimodal transport, making it possible to live without necessarily having a car. I think these are things that are going to need to happen for us to be able to make it. Any other questions? Okay. Let me share my screen again. So, so these are principles that that we've adopted as a way to create these guardrails. So we have a committee, and we've got a lot of strong personalities on our committee. And what we want to do is ensure that we have a framework within which we can operate and be able to say, okay, well, we appreciate this angle that's been raised. However, it's outside of the guardrails. And so we talk about maximizing the impact of EV adoption. So anything that allows us to do that. Anything that allows us to ensure that we're able to continue to reduce emissions. Timing is really important, right? There are some solutions that have been proposed that don't make sense at the moment. There's a sequence of events that need to take place for us to be able to achieve what we need to do, and so timing is important. We can't do it alone, so we've been partnering with many other organizations to make this happen. Because there are many organizations here that are all focused on sustainability and climate change and greenhouse gas emissions reductions, there are many opportunities for us to collaborate, and we take hold of that. Mandates only when necessary. So there was a bill, Tam, there was a bill, right, that was introduced, which was, I guess, for Hawaii to ban gas cars, right? Do you recall that one?
Talked about it.
Yeah. So we weren't supportive of that. We submitted comments, but we weren't supportive of that, despite other organizations being in support of it. And the reason for it is exactly what we talked about earlier. There are other strategies that we can employ first. So the carrot versus, what is it? The carrot versus the, yeah. And then also a balanced approach. So, this is also a struggle for us because when we come up with a proposal, a policy proposal, we have to balance. It has to be sustainable. We need to take into account, the legs of the economy, the environment, and also social impact, social equity. So these are principles that we put together early on. We revisit it every year, but it guides our actions and what we do. The other thing is we've come up with priorities. So there are many things that we can focus on, but these are the priority areas that we're working on. So zero emission vehicle standard, incentives, and then also charging infrastructure. Lastly, the strategies that we employ. So I'll spend a few moments with each of these. So the first thing is maybe a no-brainer, and that is essentially politics, right? You've got key legislators out there. You've got the chairs of the key committees. We don't want to necessarily try to spend time with every single legislator, but there are certain ones that are influential, and we want to be able to, connect with them and establish rapport with them. Be able to pick up the phone or text them and get a response for a question that we have, as an example. The other thing is co-development. So coming up with bills or developing bills with our legislators. A good example, Tam and I worked with county council members to come up with a bill that's called Bill 120, which is going to enforce the charging and parking rules here on Hawaii Island. It was co-development. We worked together to come up with the language of the bill, and that allowed us to get our word in, but it also allowed them to take ownership of the bill. I mentioned earlier collaboration. This group called Hawaii Environmental Change Agents. This is like a whole bunch of environmental groups, 350 Hawaii, climate protectors, et cetera. So we collaborate with them during this legislative process because they're also very active. And they have bills that they need support from us for, and vice versa. They support the bills that we're endorsing. We put in a very robust tracking process, as well as a team, and also a part of our website that allowed us this session to communicate with the public and people that wanted to submit testimony. I'll show you in a minute here just what that looks like. And then we were very active, submitting testimony, doing the Zoom, testifying over Zoom, making calls, emails, etc. And importantly, we mobilized our organization. So there were certain bills where we actually sent an email blast to our members, and they were able to submit a lot of testimony supporting our point of view. So these were the things that we employed to move things along. And Tam, did I miss anything? I admit I kind of put this together earlier.
No, that's great. And just FYI, time is almost up, but go ahead and finish up. And I know you wanted to show the spreadsheet we use.
Yeah. So real quick, this is hawaiiev.org. We put a section in here for legislation, and essentially our members and general public, they were able to come in here and identify the latest and greatest as it relates to the bill. So they came here. We also put together an alert sign up where they can actually let us know if they wanted to be on the email list for alerts. And then there was also a database that we exposed on the website where they're actually able to get information about each bill, including the testimony that we submitted, so that they can have examples of what they can submit. Anyway, I just wanted to call attention to the fact that we invested a lot of time to provide these tools to the general public so that they can learn how to submit testimony. They can see examples of testimony that they can submit and be a part of the process. So that was it. Tam, are you saying there's no more time for questions, or are we moving into questions?
We're pretty much at time, but go ahead. If anyone has questions, please go ahead and ask. We can take a couple minutes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned trucks a little bit. I'm just kind of curious, how does that work as far as like on the technical side where you had like towing and hauling with an electric truck where you don't have an engine brake? I assume that's been thought about, but to me that's really, that would be a really big issue if you're just relying on those brakes when you're hauling something, beyond just, a small trailer.
When you're referring to an engine brake, what specifically is that?
Yeah, so in a bigger truck, right? Your GMCs, your 25 and 3500s. When you're towing and hauling, you're going to have an engine brake, a Jake brake, similar based off what you have in a semi, right? And just personal experience, like safety wise, that makes a huge difference, especially when you're hauling stuff downhill. So I was just curious.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all know, especially in Hawaii, most people don't drive trucks to haul stuff. but I mean that I think that there is an application where just not having an engine brake could be a concern.
Yeah. So I'll have to research that more, but my understanding is, and we see this with like the Tesla Semi and all these big freight trucks that all have already been developed as well, is that the regenerative braking is what replaces the Jake brake. So when you let off the accelerator, the vehicle is dramatically slows down, and it's stronger with certain vehicles. And I expect that it's probably going to be really strong with the trucks. I haven't gotten in one, and I haven't seen the details, but I don't know, Tam, maybe you have.
Your answer is correct. Yeah, I think the regen braking is the equivalent. I don't know exactly how it compares, like braking effectiveness wise, but I know from the cars I've driven, the REVs, the regen braking is pretty effective. And there's a cool feature actually in most EVs now where they have 1 foot driving, where when you take your foot off the gas, it automatically puts the regen on. So you slow down automatically, and it can be pretty dramatic sometimes depending on the, the settings.
Thank you.
A related question. You had mentioned that one of the state policies was to electrify their fleet. What about the bus? I see the bus all over Oahu, and are they going to electrify their fleet of buses? And how much is that going to cost? Because it's not like swapping one motor for another. You have to buy an entire platform. And to my knowledge, they're not building these buses in Hawaii. We have to ship them.
Yeah. So they are being transitioned as well. So I think Oahu recently got 10 electric buses, if I'm not mistaken. Hawaii Island, it was published recently that we are getting, a total of 10 as well in the coming year. The question about how this is happening is interesting because of this partnership, this private-public partnership arrangement with sustainability partners. So it's essentially, we're buying miles. We're not buying equipment. We're not buying charging stations. So this company's coming in, they're saying, okay, we're going to give you all these buses, all these vehicles and the related charging stations, and you're going to pay us for the use of the vehicles by mile. So all the state is paying is the use of the infrastructure, and this company is actually in charge of ensuring that the vehicles are operational, that the charging stations are operational. We don't have to deal with all those expenses. So that's the immediate response, because we have this 10-year contract with them and they're actively working to make it happen. Okay, any other questions before we wrap up? Before I wrap up? Okay.
Well, thanks so much, Noel. Really good stuff. And thanks for letting me record. Yeah, little hand here. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Enjoy your evening, and I'll be in touch.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
All right.
Aloha.
Yeah. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen here. I'd take a minute to stretch here while I pop this up.
Hey, Dallin, did you hear about the Nikola semi-truck scandal and the fact that they showed off an electric semi-truck that couldn't actually drive itself, and he had to resign in disgrace because he was lying to investors about his company's ability to revolutionize long-haul transit? I just read that they delivered 2 vehicles to California, but that was just before he had to resign in disgrace. So there are companies trying to electrify semis, but I don't think it was brakes that was preventing it from coming to fruition.
More fraud in that case. Yeah, I read about that too. Yeah, also, of course, Tesla has their semi coming out. It's been delayed like a lot of their vehicles, but one rule we've learned, I think, after looking at Elon Musk's career, never bet against him. He'll get it done eventually, but it has been delayed. Great. Let's dive back in here. And we are, as we can see from the last talk, talking this week about alternative vehicle policy. And we've talked quite a bit about EVs before because it has been my focus in terms of really where I put my energy and my concern. Because as I think I've also mentioned, for me, in tracking the climate change field and the green energy transition now for, I guess almost 30 years, frankly, it became fairly clear to me maybe a decade ago that the electricity transition was, going pretty well. And we could see the future well enough to know that we're going to be, I think, pretty good on electricity, particularly in the last 7-8 years. It became really quite clear as coal began to phase out. And of course, there are many asterisks there. We can look to China and they're building more coal. So we're not out of the woods yet, but we can see, the longer term trends. And that seems very likely, I'd say, in the next 20 years or so, we're going to be, predominantly green energy for electricity around the world. For quite some time, I didn't feel as confident about the vehicle transition, because we didn't have really any viable options other than, biking and car sharing and walking, which are great. But of course, they're not going to be applicable for a lot of people who are addicted to driving, or in many cases just need to drive, because as you'll see from the chapter we read this week, there has been a huge increase in vehicle miles traveled in the last 50, 60 years, driven in large part by increasing suburbanization and increasing commute times. And so that's a huge issue in terms of reducing GHGs more generally. The difference, of course, now, and we'll see more today and next week, is that we do have now a number of really viable options to get out of traditional fossil fuel cars. So let's dive into that a bit. But let's first look at some news items. A lot in the news lately, of course. And first, some good news. I'll talk in a sec about the US Postal Service and their ongoing drama. But first, I want to kind of just convey that in the same vehicle space with the competitors to USPS, including UPS, FedEx, and then Amazon, because they're actually delivering more and more of their own goods, they are all pretty committed to going EV at a much higher level than the USPS. And you guys might have seen, actually, I think maybe it was a few months ago, Amazon announced they were going to buy up to 100,000 Rivian delivery vehicles by 2024. So that's still very early on in that process. And Rivian, of course, is barely producing any vehicles at all. So we'll see over time if it really comes to that level. But it's looking pretty good. They are producing some vehicles now, real company. They have some real capital. There's also some interesting developments with the USPS. They, in fact, announced just today their final contract, at least their latest final contract. And they're now looking to achieve 20% EVs rather than 10. And that translates to about 10,000 new EVs. I'll get to this in a second here, but I got the press release today too for some reason. So we talked about this before, where there's a lot of outcry when USPS and the Postmaster General, who is a carryover from the Trump years, has not been particularly eager to embrace EVs, even though it seems that that use case for post delivery is pretty ideal for going fully EV in the near future. There's also been some debate about the war in Ukraine, and will that actually negatively impact the EV transition? And this is very debatable. It's a very unfortunate set of events, but I'm kind of a silver linings kind of guy. And it seems to me there is a pretty clear silver lining here, in that it has reminded everyone yet again, the latest crisis of fossil fuel supply and dealing with unsavory fossil fuel delivering countries, that we need to get off fossil fuels. And we are now, as we talked about last week, on paper, independent in the US in terms of producing as much oil as we actually consume, but it's not a complete match, because we export a lot, we still import a lot for refining, et cetera. So it's not like we could suddenly become independent tomorrow of imported oil. If we had all oil imports cut off tomorrow, we would be suffering to a great degree in the US, despite the fact we are producing a ton of oil in the last decade, up a lot from its dip in the 70s. The reason, though, that some are looking at Ukraine possibly negatively impacting EV transition is that there are, in fact, some rare metals and other commodities produced in Russia and Ukraine. And if, in fact, Russia does kind of branch off with China and other countries and really create an almost separate economic sphere, like in the last Cold War, that will definitely have a negative impact in the near term on the EV transition. But perhaps that won't happen. Let's hope it doesn't happen. And of course, we would in the West, I think, adjust to it fairly quickly. We have the dubious honor of reaching new gas price highs in the last week or so. We are not as high as California now. This picture is a real picture from a couple of days ago in LA, Silver Lake, where you can see the regular is $6.69, which is pretty shocking if you're used to gas in the, $3 to $4 range, which of course is even way higher. I recall, actually dating myself, I bought my first car, I guess it was back in the 90s here in Hawaii, actually. And then I recall driving down the coast of from Washington to California, and I paid at one point in that trip 89 cents a gallon for gas, and it cost me $10 to fill up my car. And that was a distant dream, because when I filled up I have a work SUV here I use occasionally, and I filled it up recently and it cost me $87. Not quite as nice as $10. And then the last thing I'll mention here in the news is a similar issue related to climate change, but not specifically climate change. Some are also speculating for the same reasons, that we might have a global food crisis resulting from the Ukraine war, because Ukraine and Russia combined produce, 1/3 of the world's wheat, a ton of the barley in the world, other commodities, not just, fossil fuels. And so if there is a major cutoff, we could see food prices, sky high, even beyond what they already are in Hawaii, which are, I believe, the highest in the nation here in Hawaii. So some good, some bad as usual. Anyone else want to chime in with some news items? Go ahead, Jake.
Thanks. A couple I saw in the last, I guess, 2 weeks. One, speaking of Rivian, New York Times story, I'll put it in the chat right after, but relating to a big new plant in the state of Georgia, and how it's become it's kind of your classic like balance of interest. You have people against the plant, and because of the environmental impact of the plant itself. But looks like it's supposed to be a huge plant, and it's gotten to be it's an interesting political battle between two Republicans. Like the current governor is a pro-plant Republican, and then the other Republican has sort of joined forces with some of the like anti-development left-wing types to oppose the plant. And then another one I saw, actually it was a podcast, The Daily on New York Times, about cobalt, and we've talked a little bit about like the materials that go into I assume it's for the battery specifically. Yeah. I mean, I know cobalt is just a big part of it, as are other, and Joho and others have mentioned this. But a big thing about the country of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the cobalt mining industry there. I'll put that in the chat also.
Great. Yeah, the Rivian plant is potentially quite a big deal. It's good to see yet another homegrown EV company doing well, and just judged by their market value and the interest in that company, it's looking pretty good for them to actually really ramp up production. But they are still at this point at a quite low level. Just so I think, I don't know exactly how many, I think under 1,000 vehicles delivered so far. And then on the same note, we did see, of course, this week, a lot of you probably saw this, Tesla's factory in Berlin, their latest gigafactory, did actually open, and Elon Musk even danced. So that's big news. But that's a big deal, because they have actually another 500,000 cars they can produce now from that plant. They're going to be getting to about 1.5 million cars delivered this year in 2023, which is just phenomenal to think about that. And having followed Tesla now since their beginning, to see them actually following through on those production numbers is just pretty phenomenal. Anyone else? Joho, real quick.
Yeah, listening to HPR, I listened to a public transportation analyst talk about cities pushing for free ridership of their public buses because of the immense decline that their public transportation systems, particularly in Kansas City, Salt Lake City, even Boston, they were experimenting with free fares where you could just hop on any bus or subway, don't have to pay the fee. Mm-hmm. And it was really an experiment at first, but they found that ridership exceeded even the pre-COVID levels once these systems were free for all. And now some cities are recommending that they do away with fares. And I thought it was interesting because this analyst, this expert who's been working in the field for 20 years, is that all these public transport systems don't make money. Doesn't matter how much they charge. In fact, a lot of the money that the fare pays for is for the people and the ticket counters and the maintenance. So by having fares, you're actually increasing the cost of making these systems completely unprofitable. And so, for those who think that the bus is making money for the city, it's not. And doing away with the fare would actually not only increase ridership, decrease greenhouse gases, but it would actually be a cost savings. And I thought that was interesting. I wanted to know if anyone had any comments about whether free ridership programs should be present here in the state.
Go ahead, Jake.
Not specific to that, but just one personal experience to share is back in New York City, where I'm from. The Staten Island ferry, when I was a kid, used to charge like, it was silly. It was like a quarter or 50 cents or something. And then they just went totally free. And I don't think anyone misses it. I think it just simplified things considerably.
Yeah, and Joho, actually on the Big Island now, the bus is free as of like a month or two ago. So they decided, because of the big dip in ridership during COVID, and then of course they got some federal funding, that they could actually afford to not charge. So we'll see if it continues. But I agree, it'd be nice if it is free. And I'm guilty of, rarely taking the bus here. I've taken like maybe once or twice. I'm curious, show of hands, who actually takes public transit in Honolulu or on Oahu very often? Can't see all your hands right now. I don't see any at all. Okay.
Farah was the brave sole person.
Okay, good to see. And I'm curious too, when I was there last month, and by the way, I'll be back next week for in-person instruction. When I was there last month, I was actually riding the scooters around a lot, the GoX scooters. That was basically my public transit was a GoX, and also some Beaky. Any of you all use those two modalities at all? Not so much. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on here. Just very quickly on this. So this is a press release from a group called the Zero Emission Transportation Association, which has been, following the Postmaster General and his decisions on the EV vans, and they were pressing for a lot higher achievement, but they were at least part of this push that was successful in getting a doubling of the prior commitment to 10% of the vans being electric. Now they're going to 20%. They said at least 20%. So again, it may change over time. This is a longer term program. But it seems like, I haven't delved into the issue in great detail myself, but it seems like the arguments rolled out so far by the USPS don't make a whole lot of sense, just, on face value. Okay, so a different issue, just FYI, we do have the first draft of class reviews due in 3 weeks. And again, like with the topic, this is meant to be a chance for me to give you feedback on your draft. So I don't expect a polished draft. It's a first draft, and I'm going to give you feedback on that and help you hone it into the best paper it can be. And then also, if any of you are aspiring to publish your paper, there's many opportunities to submit your paper when it is finished to journals for publication. It can be law journals, it can be policy journals. Also some conferences like this one here that actually Julie sent to me, an annual conference. This one is in Vancouver in British Columbia. They should call for papers, and that implies that you would give a presentation and then they'd actually publish your paper as part of a collection for that conference. So if you're interested, you can click on the link here. Any questions on papers?
I just wanted to confirm, so 3 weeks means 14th April?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so let's turn to the main topic for today. And there's some overlap here and some jumping around because of guest speakers, et cetera. But I'm going to talk today mainly about U.S. vehicle fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE standards. We'll dive in next week to more reading specific to this. I know the reading this week was mainly about transportation and land use, but there's a lot of overlap, obviously, here between all these issues. So I wanted to kind of set the stage here and remind people why this is a big deal for the US in the climate change context. I've shown these slides twice before now, so hopefully they're not new to you. But we have seen, in the last 30 years, a 40% drop in GHG emissions from the electricity sector. So again, it supports what I was saying before about, being able to see the future more clearly in this sector, because the long-term trend here in the last 20 years has been, pretty sharply downwards. Not so much for transportation. Again, we talked about this before, but since 1990, we've seen this trend up by 23%. It is down from its peak still in around 2005, 2006, and this goes through 2019. And so, of course, we're going to see a bit of a dip for 2020, but I believe this roared back in 2021 to about the same. So this again really highlights the need to focus policy efforts on the transportation sector, which is responsible in the US for about 1/3 up to 40%, depending on who you are looking at, of total emissions. So it's the biggest single sector. It's also the one that is the least clearly trending downwards for now. And partly why, and this was discussed in the chapter, is vehicle miles traveled. This is a very common measure used in transportation, and it means it's what it sounds like. It's just how many vehicles are driven, how many miles, add it all up. And in this case, we've seen a very strong trend upwards for the last 30 years. It actually goes back a lot further than that in terms of this trend. There was a bit of a dip in the Great Recession in 07, 08, but then it trended back up in the last 8 years, and then this funny dip happened in 2020. But then, of course, as I just mentioned, this, I believe, roared back pretty quickly in 2021. There is, I think, still some lag in the system, though, because a lot of people still are working from home, but not everyone can work from home. So it hasn't affected everyone, of course. Looking to Hawaii, when I saw this, I felt a bit guilty because so the average for the U.S. for vehicle miles traveled, per person, I guess is around, I don't see the actual average figure here, but it's around, I think, 15, bit less than that, perhaps. Hawaii is much lower at about 7,500. I felt a bit guilty when I saw this because actually I drive probably about 15,000 miles per year on the Big Island, because ironically, even though I live in Hawaii in a rural area, I do quite a bit of driving up and down the coast and over to Kona and back. And so at least I'm driving on sunshine. Okay, so
sorry, just real quick, do you have any idea why Alaska? Do you have any idea why Alaska is so low and lower even than we are?
I saw that,
I would think Alaska would be up with Wyoming.
Yeah, I don't have any idea why Alaska is so low. Yeah, I'm curious. If you get a chance to look it up and find any answers, let me know, because yeah, I don't know why it'd be different than culturally. It's quite a lot like Wyoming. It's much bigger even. It may be a lack of roads. They may
that's it. A lot of the communities are not connected by highways.
Yeah, you
have to fly float plane to Nome, Alaska, and so it's not like Wyoming, which is built off of interstates, and everyone can drive everywhere. A lot of Alaskans actually fly to work, with bush pilots flying them if they have to commute to work and they live in a rural area. So it's really because of lack of connectivity.
So that doesn't count as vehicle miles traveled. You're flying,
not driving,
not cars. Yeah, if you added in aviation miles traveled, then perhaps it would. So yeah, it's important to include apples to apples, right? Anyone else? Questions or comments on the VNT?
Just a comment. I go, and Jake, you probably know this as well. Going to boarding school in Connecticut, I had many friends from New York City who didn't get a driver's license. I had friends in law school at BC who also didn't have a driver's license if they lived in New York City, because they never had a need, because the subway and the taxis would take them whenever they need to go. So in the reading, it didn't surprise me that New York City was one of the places that had the fewest VNTs. And I'm sure if you were able to take New York City out of that, then the numbers would go higher, because my friends in upstate New York certainly drive because they don't have.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Not seeing any more hands. Let's move on. I want to just mention and kind of queue up this complete streets policy discussion. And this was discussed briefly in the chapter. And I don't want to jump in and kind of describe what complete streets is. So complete streets as the go ahead, Joe.
So as the graphic explains, it provides traffic lanes for all types of travelers and not just for vehicular traffic. And the important thing is it creates safe spaces for people to travel. I had a friend in New York who was run over by a bus biking to work because there wasn't a dedicated bike lane. And here the image says it all. You know, most municipalities, when they develop their transportation systems, they weren't thinking about pedestrians. They weren't thinking about bikes. They weren't thinking about segways. Interestingly enough, some communities were thinking more about horses than any other type. But that's what Complete Streets, you know, is trying to realize. You know, it's because one of the deterrents from using non-motor vehicle traffic is they don't have dedicated lanes or safe places where they could use these alternative modes of transportation like they do in Europe. And I'll leave it there. Just go to Europe if you want to see examples of complete streets.
Yeah, and I might actually try and do a little segment on biking at some point, because I've heard so many stories, obviously anecdotal by definition, but I've heard so many stories about people getting hurt or killed biking. And it's really unfortunate because, of course, biking is so good in terms of health and the environment. And yet, yeah, so many areas don't have good bike lanes. And even if they do, it can still be quite dangerous. But yeah, Complete Streets is meant to be, as the name suggests, a way to create streets that are not just for cars, because, of course, life is about a lot more than cars. And communities that have a lot of walking and biking and open space and community space and parks and attractive areas are much better to live in, create better social fabric, etc. So a lot of reasons to support this. We're going to have Heather Kimball, county council member from Hawaii, as a guest speaker toward the end of the class. And she is actually proposing a Complete Streets initiative for part of the Big Island. And so this is a fairly new program to me, but it sounds really cool. To me, it captures a lot of what we need to do, not just in the environment, but also socially, economically, et cetera. Kind of one of those classic win-win-wins. But I wanted to also highlight that, you know, we're talking about vehicle fuel efficiency, and we'll revisit this at the end of today's class if we have time. But as you all know from prior classes, one thing I really like to look at is, do policies work? You know, there's a lot of incentives for policymakers and advocates and politicians to, you know, do things more for the sake of doing something and having it look like they're doing something without really going back, you know, well, either before they create a new policy to do the research, is it likely to work? And then even less incentive to go back years later and see, did it actually work? And so we'll talk a bit at the end here about, do CAFE standards actually work? There is some data to show, and I'll share this up front, that a key driver, unsurprisingly, of fuel efficiency and consumption more generally, or gas prices. And that's, of course, mostly a market decision. It's not a policy decision. But there is some change in recent years for various reasons. Now, on a related note, I wanted to look at this because this is very timely, given the latest, you know, global crisis. Do prices actually influence purchasing behavior? And again, we can say anecdotally, yes. And today, New York Times had an article about the author in California trying to find an EV to buy, and how it was so hard to find one because everyone's buying one, and you know, even new cars are really in short supply, and used cars are impossible to find. So it does seem anecdotally that we're seeing a big increase. But in the past, it's not always been the case. They actually mixed data on this. I won't read the quotes, but these are basically summarizing different studies, finding, you know, different conclusions that, you know, sometimes, yes, prices do influence purchasing behavior. Other times they don't. And of course, we'll recognize, you know, if you've been around for a few years, that gas prices go up and down. They've stayed pretty high for a while now, though. Even when oil prices dip really low, the gas prices didn't go too low here in the US or in Hawaii. But what's changed in 2022? There's definitely, you know, a big shift in the last couple of years. And that, of course, is the availability of really, you know, high quality and longer range electric vehicles. And we can look at the actual data, not just anecdotes, to see that's true. Looking back just 10 years ago, 2012, you had 50,000 EV sales, and this is all electric and also plug-in hybrids. So again, a plug-in hybrid would be like a Chevy Volt or a BMW i3, whereas the pure or all electric vehicle will be, the Model Y or the Chevy Bolt with a B. And you can see again here in 2021, and in actually the last 3 years, the pure electrics have actually been outselling the plug-ins by a large margin. And we saw a big jump in 2018. Anyone know what that was due to? It begins with T.
You're talking about the Tesla, basically the non $100,000 version.
Exactly. Yeah. The Model 3 came out in 2018 and made a big bump in sales, and it actually declined for 2 years, sadly. 2019 declined because of that pent-up demand for the Model 3. 2020 declined for obvious reasons with the pandemic. 2021 saw a massive boost. And anyone want to venture a guess as to why we saw such a boost in 2021? Same answer. Tesla Model Y came out. And again, a lot of pent-up demand because it's a crossover SUV, great car. That's the one that made me decide to go for a Tesla. The Model Y came out, so I was not alone. In fact, we saw a ton of people in the US buying Model Ys last year. And of course, this year is continuing apace. So we saw over 600,000 new electric car sales in the US alone. And globally, I don't know the figure, but I think it's well into the 3 or 4 million, if not higher, for last year. And I think it's like 7 million this year. So a big shift. And so that's why we can, I think, expect to see the latest gas, fossil fuel crisis lead to a real shift. And who knows, this may be like the big shift that really kind of sees this kind of accelerating transition away from fossil fuels, particularly this year, as we see more and more, as Noel talked about, of the EV trucks. And we talked before how there are still a ton of trucks being sold in the US. And so as we get more and more trucks coming in, taking away that market share from the traditional fossil fuel market, we may in fact see a good chance of getting, I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, and I'll look back 8 years from now at this presentation, and I wouldn't be surprised if we actually reach almost 100% EV sales by 2030 in the US without a mandate. I think market forces are well on track to achieve that, and maybe like 90% or 95%, but we already see Norway achieving that really sky-high level of adoption. They're not there for all vehicles, but for their new sales per year, they're already at 90%, which is incredible. But they, of course, have a pretty big incentive that we don't have here in the US, at least nowhere near as big as Norway does. So there are, dozens of vehicles coming on the market in the next few years. So what has caused this boom in hybrids and EVs in recent years? And this goes to, what I mentioned about my inquiring mind always kind of wanting to know what causes what, because policy is all about what causes what, right? What's the causal chain? And part of that inquiry is recognizing the scientific humility necessary in answering those kind of questions. You actually can never know what causes what, except in some cases where, let's say, if you're an advocate and you're advocating for a new bill, and the key committee chairs say, Tam, it was because of you and your advocacy that we passed this bill. I'd be like, great, that's pretty good evidence that I was effective. That, of course, never actually happens, right? No one has ever told me that. So it's really hard to know in any of these cases, what actually led to things happening, because everyone has their own incentives, everyone has their own agenda. But it's really important to kind of think through what seems to have worked in prior years, and more importantly, even what doesn't work. And so there are a lot of claims about causality made, whether it's in science or policy or what have you, but it's really important, if you're being a good policy attorney, to really think through those causal chains and see if they're valid. So looking at this, I wanted to just open this up real quickly, and we only have a few more minutes, unfortunately. What do you all think? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just asking for your opinions. what do you think has caused the boom in hybrids and EVs in recent years? And I mean the boom in kind of in terms of the availability of these new and better and long range cars, which is something new under the sun here. Let's Loredana speak first here.
I would say that definitely the marketing is a big factor in both the consumer and just the general public in general. Like, people hear more about it and they don't feel like it's just for rich people. It was made more let's say mainstream because of marketing and all these ads. So yeah, I would say that's the main reason.
That's a big factor in increasing sales. I'm asking more about why are there so many new vehicle models available, whether hybrids or EVs?
Okay, then definitely also all the legislative acts that passed are like, oh, you can't sell any cars that are like gas. It's pushing the manufacturer to think more of electric models.
Yeah, that's definitely been a factor. Grant, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I think similar to Laurie's point, I think part of it is as you have more electric cars getting, and I think from models like you want to replace SUVs, you want to replace trucks. For a long time, if you had an electric vehicle, it was like a sedan or a compact car. So I think expanding it to different models of cars, really kind of having different car companies who were traditionally in one model or another being able to kind of find their lane in the EV space. I think that's also super helpful and a big reason why it's boomed.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say competition in the market. It took time for the traditional motor vehicle manufacturers to, one, come to the realization that Tesla was taking their market share. Regardless of regulations, there was a driving force within the marketplace to switch from internal combustion to electric vehicles. But they couldn't build their factories from the ground up. They had to retool, and it took time to do that. One, to convince the board that this was the direction to go. Tesla wasn't profitable for the longest time, but then the Model 3, which was his Model T, came out, and that's when they saw that this was the future. I agree with Loredana that regulations such coming out of California and the Clean Air Act might have certainly inspired some of the more how should I say, recalcitrant or conservative manufacturers to take the time and money to go into their factories and create a line where they could actually produce plugins and hybrids. But I saw this happening 10 years ago. I agree with Loredana. It was somewhat marketing that brought Tesla to the forefront, where it was a luxury vehicle. It was something that you aspired to attain. The Model S took my breath away, took a lot of people's away, and then Motor Vehicle gave it a perfect rating. They'd never done that before. And then when all of a sudden those who saw people with Model S's as being status symbol were able to afford a Model 3, the other manufacturers were already, if they weren't already producing something to provide another option, they were on their way, because they saw Tesla taking market share away from them because the consumer wanted something that didn't require putting gas into their car. And so I think that it's a complex answer. As you well know, it's not one factor, it's multiple factors. But I wouldn't discount Loredana saying that marketing, getting into the minds of the consumers, brought them to Tesla. Those who could buy saw it. Other people then saw it as a status symbol. They wanted it. Some of them bought the cheaper versions from other manufacturers. And then Toyota, Ford, everyone started realizing that we need to start producing electric vehicles. We need to produce affordable electric vehicles. And the longer we wait, the more profit share these other companies are going to take from us. So I do think that the market, it was a huge driving force for the increase in manufacturing of EVs.
Yeah, it's complex for sure. A lot of things going on. Joel, go ahead.
I just wanted to agree with everybody. I think marketing, competition, I think competition especially is driving, because I don't think any car manufacturer wants to be the last one to hop on board, because not only is it going to make them look bad for being the last car company to transition to electric vehicles, it's also going to mean they're going to lose out a lot of money by not having electric vehicles to sell when people are actually really into it in this transition phase between going from gasoline powered cars to electric vehicles.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Farah, go ahead. Farah, are you there?
Yeah. For me, I think it also took oh, sorry, is my internet okay? Is it? Can you
It
hear
might
me?
be me. Yeah, you're fine now. Go ahead.
Can-
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I think my internet is struggling a little bit. Is it okay now?
You sound
Or-
fine now. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think after Tesla, it probably took a little bit more time for, the knowledge to be diffusing out into the industry. Companies aren't just companies, they're built with people and experts. And it probably took a while to get that knowledge and to build expertise, and then for other companies to come and either hire these people or to be able to find people to get this expertise. So I think that probably took time. And once eventually you get that, solid group of people in different companies to be starting to work on EVs, then it could progress. So I think definitely it's the knowledge, the diffusion of this knowledge about EVs rather than just your typical gas cars.
Yeah, thank you. Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, just on a final note. So, I mean, auto manufacturers, they're not going to spend the money to develop a more fuel efficient engine. So the fact that, a lot of European countries in the United States, they're trying to phase out ICE engines. So yeah, why not just go electric at that point?
Yeah, there is an interesting effort to actually improve ICE engines still, because this kind of recent shift where a lot of OEMs, they call them original engine manufacturers, the main car companies, OEMs, they have announced, as Noel mentioned, a lot of them efforts to really fully electrify their fleet. But that means in many cases still offering an electric model as well as a regular ICE model. And so there has been a lot of effort in the last 10 years to develop more efficient ICE engines to meet the CAFE standards. We'll talk more about that next week. But I think a lot of people are now realizing in the OEM space and in the policymaker community that just the differential in efficiency between EVs and even the best ICE engines is still like a 3-to-1 difference. Like the worst EV motor is like 3 times as efficient as the best ICE engine. So it's just like there's a really uneven, starting point. And I think this is kind of like when you have those differentials and the car is getting better and better and the battery is getting cheaper and cheaper, it gets harder and harder to make the case, particularly with the consumer demand for cleaner vehicles and again the status factor that Tesla's managed to harness so well. Anyone else final comments, or should we wrap it up here? I don't see any more raised hands. Okay, great. Well, awesome. I'll see you next week in person. I saw the mask mandate is still in place for UH, unfortunately, for in class. But I'll see your faces one of these days. So I'll see you next week. Thanks.